Do not breach that door, Admiral. The thermal decay on the ridge is too consistent. Get this analyst off the comms. Master Chief, proceed with the breach. We are on the clock. Sir, please listen. That is not background radiation from the rocks. It is a rhythmic heat signature. A spotter. If your team kicks that door, they trigger the pressure plates wired to the spotter's line of sight. It is a kill box. You are a Sergeant E5. I am an Admiral commanding SEAL Team 6 elements. Do not presume to lecture me on tactical entry based on a satellite feed and a hunch. It is not a hunch. It is the exact same grid setup used in the Kandahar Valley ambush 7 years ago. I know because I was the one who had to neutralize the spotter. Enough. Security, remove her from the Joint Operations Center. Look at the map, sir. Just look at the elevation. The sergeant lunged forward, not to attack, but to override the comms lock on the console. Her hand slammed onto the digital table, fingers flying across the interface to bring up the magnified topography. In the violence of the motion, her uniform sleeve rode up her forearm. The fluorescent lights of the command center caught the ink on her pale skin. A stylized eye inside a chaotic spiral, followed by a faded string of latitude and longitude coordinates. The room went silent. The Admiral's hand, raised to signal the security detail, stopped in midair. He stared at the wrist of the woman he had just dismissed. The silence stretched, heavier than the static on the radio. "Wait," the Admiral whispered, his voice cracking. "Belay that breach order. All teams, hold position." Chart 36 hours earlier. Forward operating base, Dust Bowl, border region. The air conditioning unit in the prefabricated barracks rattled with the desperate mechanical coughing of a machine dying of thirst. It did little to combat the heat that radiated from the arid landscape outside. A relentless oven that turned the inside of forward operating base, Dust Bowl, into a slow cooker. Sergeant Elena Vance sat at her workstation, her posture rigid, her spine not touching the back of the cheap swivel chair. It was a habit drilled into her marrow, a physical memory of days spent lying prone in the dirt for 72 hours straight, where movement meant death. Now her battlefield was a glowing bank of 3 monitors, and her weapon was a keyboard with faded letters. "Vance, the coffee is sludge. You want some?" Corporal Miller called out from the break alcove, holding up a glass pot that contained a liquid with the viscosity of motor oil. "Pass," Elena said, her voice low and even. She didn't look away from her screen. Her eyes were scanning line after line of logistical supply codes. It was mind-numbing work, tracking fuel convoys, counting pallets of MREs, flagging discrepancies in water delivery. It was the kind of work they gave to soldiers they didn't know what else to do with, the ones who came back with files too redacted to read and medical evaluations too complex to discuss. She adjusted the cuffs of her uniform blouse, ensuring they were buttoned tight at the wrist. The fabric was scratchy against her skin, a constant, grounding irritation. "Suit yourself," Miller shrugged, pouring the sludge into a styrofoam cup. "Hear about the VIP inbound? Rumor is it's a 2-star, maybe even a 3-star. Big brass." Elena's fingers paused for a fraction of a second over the keys. "Admiral Sterling," she corrected him without turning. "Commander of Nav Spekwar Group 1. Miller whistled. "SEALs. Great. They always eat all the good food in the mess hall and treat us like furniture." "How do you know?" "I read the flight manifest logs, Miller. It is my job." It was a lie, or at least a partial truth. She had seen the manifest, yes, but she also knew Sterling by reputation. 7 years ago, in a valley that didn't exist on most civilian maps, a younger Captain Sterling had been the extraction commander for an operation that went sideways. He had been the voice on the radio begging for Overwatch when his team was pinned down. She had been the answer to that prayer, looking through a scope from 800 yards away. He didn't know her name. He only knew her call sign, Ghost 1. And he definitely wouldn't recognize the quiet, pale analyst organizing Excel spreadsheets in a dusty container in the middle of nowhere. A secure notification blinked on her primary monitor. A red border pulsed softly. Priority Level 1. Operation Red Dust. File transfer complete. Elena clicked the file. As the map loaded, rendering the 3D topography of the target area, the ambient noise of the office, Miller's slurping, the rattling AC, the distant hum of generators, faded into a dull buzz. The map showed a jagged scar of a canyon, deep and twisting, bordered by high ridges that offered perfect enfilade fire. Her breath hitched. A phantom sensation, sharp and cold, pricked at the base of her neck. She knew those ridges. She knew the way the wind curled around the northern peak, deceptive and erratic. She knew how the shadows stretched at 1400 hours, hiding movement in the rocks. "Miller," Elena said, and this time there was an edge to her voice that made the corporal look up sharply. "Yeah?" "Pull the archived satellite imagery for Sector 4. The thermal scans from 2018. 2018? Sarge, that's ancient history. Why do you need— Just do it," she snapped. The command didn't sound like it came from an analyst. It sounded like it came from someone holding a detonator. Miller blinked, startled, and scrambled to his keyboard. Okay. Pulling it up. Elena stared at the screen, at the path marked in blue for the SEAL team's insertion. It ran right through the kill zone. They were walking into the same trap that had nearly killed her unit. And the man leading them was the one man who should have known better. "Welcome to the Dust Bowl, Admiral," she whispered to the empty room, her hand unconsciously drifting to her left wrist, gripping it tight over the fabric of her uniform. "Don't get them killed." The vibration arrived before the sound. It started as a subtle tremor in the corrugated metal floor of the intelligence container, causing the liquid in Miller's styrofoam cup to ripple in concentric circles. Then came the thumping, a rhythmic beating of the air that resonated in the chest cavity, growing louder with every second until it drowned out the hum of the servers. "Showtime," Miller muttered, abandoning his coffee. "Base commander wants everyone on the tarmac. Dress right. Dress." Elena stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her trousers. She grabbed her cover from the desk, placed it precisely on her head, and followed Miller out into the blinding afternoon sun. The heat hit them like a physical blow, heavy and dry. Outside, the dust was already dancing. 2 UH-60 Blackhawks were on final approach, their silhouettes dark and predatory against the bleached white sky. The rotor wash kicked up a miniature sandstorm, whipping grit against the prefab structures and the faces of the assembled support personnel. Elena narrowed her eyes, shielding them slightly, but she didn't flinch. She stood at attention near the rear of the welcoming line, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture indistinguishable from a statue. The lead chopper flared, its wheels touching down with a heavy thud that shook the ground. The rotors began to slow, their whine descending in pitch. The side doors slid open. First came the security detail, men with beards, Oakley sunglasses, and suppressed rifles slung across their chests. They moved with a fluid aggression, scanning the perimeter of the friendly base as if they expected an ambush from the mess hall. Then Sergeant Sterling stepped out. He looked exactly like his press photos, perhaps even more imposing in the flesh. He wore standard fatigues, but on him they looked tailored. The silver stars on his collar caught the sun. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. A gait that was half swagger, half march. He didn't duck under the slowing rotors. He walked through the wind as if it wouldn't dare mess up his hair. The base commander, a harried-looking army major named Davies, stepped forward to salute. Sterling returned it casually, a gesture that was technically correct but dismissive in its speed. "Admiral, welcome to Dust Bowl," Davies shouted over the dying engine noise. "We have the conference room prepped and—" "Skip the pleasantries, Major." Sterling's voice cut through the noise, booming and authoritative. "My men are on a tight clock. We have a 12-hour window before the moon rises. I want boots on the ground by sunset. Where is the JOC?" "Right this way, sir." The entourage began to move, a wedge of high-ranking officers and elite operators cutting through the dusty yard. Elena watched them approach. She observed Sterling's eyes. They were constantly moving, assessing threats, assessing assets, and discarding anything deemed irrelevant. As the group passed the line of support staff, Sterling's gaze swept over them. He didn't see soldiers. He saw logistics. He saw fuel pumps and file clerks. When his eyes reached Elena, they didn't even pause. There was no recognition of a fellow warrior, no acknowledgement of the ribbons on her chest, mostly because she wasn't wearing the ones that mattered. To him, she was just part of the background scenery, as inert and functional as the sandbags stacked against the wall. Elena felt the familiar sting of invisibility. It was a sensation she had courted for years since leaving the special programs, a shield she wore to keep the nightmares at bay. But today, seeing the arrogance radiating off the man who was about to lead 12 men into a geographical meat grinder, the invisibility felt less like safety and more like a gag. She caught a whiff of him as he passed. Soap, fresh laundry detergent, and gun oil. It was a clean smell, alien to the sweat and dust of the fob. "You heard the man," a SEAL lieutenant barked at the support line, trailing in Sterling's wake. "Clear the way. Unless you have a trident, you're not needed in the war room." Miller nudged Elena, awe written all over his face. "Did you see that? That guy is a legend. They say he cleared a whole compound with a pistol in Fallujah." Elena didn't answer. She was watching Sterling's back as he disappeared into the main command building. The heavy steel doors slammed shut behind him, sealing the decision-makers inside the cool, air-conditioned sanctum of the Joint Operations Center. "Legends bleed just like everyone else, Miller," Elena said quietly, turning back toward her small, dark intelligence container. "Especially when they don't look where they're walking." She had work to do. If the Admiral wasn't going to look at the ground, someone had to do it for him. The outer office of the Joint Operations Center was a hive of controlled chaos. It served as the filtration system for the war room proper, a place where information was sanitized, sorted, and prioritized before being presented to the decision-makers behind the heavy steel doors. Phones rang with shrill insistence, and junior officers scurried between desks, carrying stacks of printed briefings. Elena navigated the room with the economy of movement that characterized everything she did. In her hand, she held a manila folder containing 3 pages of analysis and 2 printed thermal images. The paper felt heavy, burdened by the implications of what was printed on it. She stopped in front of the desk of Captain Mercer, the duty officer acting as the gatekeeper for the planning session. Mercer was a career staff officer, a man who fought wars with spreadsheets and measured success in toner cartridges. He was currently berating a supply sergeant over the phone about a shipment of batteries. Elena waited. She stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind him, counting the seconds. 45 seconds later, Mercer slammed the phone down and looked up, his face flushed with irritation. "What is it, Vance? If this is about the fuel requisition forms, I told you they can wait until tomorrow." "It is not about fuel, sir," Elena said, placing the folder on his desk. She kept her fingertips on it for a moment longer than necessary. "This is an urgent intelligence addendum for Operation Red Dust. I need you to pass it to Admiral Sterling before the mission brief concludes." Mercer blinked, looking at the folder as if it might bite him. He picked it up with a sigh and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the first paragraph, glossing over the technical details of wind shear and rock density. "Terrain analysis?" Mercer scoffed, tossing the file back onto the desk. "Sergeant, the SEALs have their own intelligence support. They have satellites, drones, and analysts with clearance levels that would make your head spin. You think they need a base analyst telling them about rocks?" "The standard satellite sweep misses the elevation variance in the northern sector, Captain," Elena pressed, her voice remaining calm despite the tightening in her chest. "The shadows in that canyon conceal a network of caves. I have cross-referenced the thermal decay signatures. It is a classic ambush setup. If they insert via the primary route, they will be walking into a fatal funnel." Mercer rubbed his temples. "Vance, we are on a timeline. The Admiral wants to launch tonight. If I walk in there and interrupt his briefing with a hunch from the logistics office about scary shadows, I will be the one getting chewed out. We do not have time for second guessing." He grabbed the folder and slid it unceremoniously into a towering stack of paperwork on the corner of his desk, the administrative, low-priority pile. "Sir, this is not administrative," Elena said, her tone hardening. "It is a safety of flight issue. It is a force protection issue." "It is filed, Sergeant," Mercer snapped, turning his attention back to his computer screen. "Dismissed." Elena stood there for a heartbeat, staring at the folder buried under a request for latrine supplies. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a nauseating frequency, a sound that seemed to drill directly into her skull. Suddenly, she wasn't in the office anymore. For a fraction of a second, the smell of toner was replaced by the copper tang of blood and the acrid scent of cordite. She remembered a lieutenant who had once dismissed her warning about a ridgeline in the Hindu Kush. She remembered the silence that followed the radio static when that lieutenant's platoon stopped reporting in. She swallowed the memory, forcing it back down into the dark box where she kept her ghosts. The chain of command was absolute. To break it was to break the backbone of the military. But to follow it now meant complicity in a disaster. "Understood, sir," Elena said. She turned and walked away, her boots making no sound on the linoleum floor. She had tried the proper way. She had respected the rank. But as she exited the building back into the blinding heat of the afternoon, Elena knew the proper way was a dead end. Mercer wasn't going to move that file. The Admiral wasn't going to see it. She stopped in the shadow of a generator, looking back at the JOC. If the front door was locked, she would have to find a window. She needed more than just thermal anomalies. She needed undeniable proof, something that even an arrogant admiral couldn't ignore. And she knew exactly where to find it, even if it meant breaking every protocol she had sworn to uphold. The intelligence container was cooler than the outside air, but it felt suffocating in a different way. Elena slid back into her chair, the foam padding compressing under her weight. The hum of the server racks seemed louder now, an accusatory drone that filled the silence left by Miller, who had wandered off to the mess hall. She stared at the blank login prompt on her tertiary monitor. What she was about to do was a career-ending event. Unauthorized access to classified historical archives without a specific warrant was a felony under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. If the system's administrator logged her keystrokes, she would be in handcuffs before sunset. But the image of the canyon would not leave her mind. It sat behind her eyes, superimposed over everything she looked at. Elena flexed her fingers, took a slow, steadying breath, and began to type. She didn't use a brute force crack. That was for amateurs in movies. Instead, she utilized a backdoor legacy code she had memorized years ago, a diagnostic pathway left open for system maintenance on these outdated, ruggedized servers. It was a quiet way in, like slipping through an unlocked window rather than kicking down the door. Access granted. Archive level, top secret, SCI. The screen flickered, washing her face in a pale, ghostly blue light. She navigated through directories that hadn't been touched in years, searching for Operation Mountain Viper 2018. Her heart rate remained steady, a slow 60 beats per minute. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She pulled up the terrain mapping files from the Korangal Valley and tiled them next to the live satellite feed of the current target area for Operation Red Dust. "Show me the pattern," she whispered. She zoomed in on the northern ridge of the current target. To the untrained eye, it was just a chaotic jumble of shale and boulders, natural debris from centuries of erosion. But Elena looked for the absence of randomness. Nature was messy. Man was precise. She applied a geometric overlay, measuring the distance between three specific large boulders located halfway up the slope. They formed an isosceles triangle. She shifted her gaze to the archived file from 2018, the same formation. The exact same spacing. Elena felt a cold sensation trickle down her spine, freezing the sweat on her back. It wasn't just similar terrain, it was engineered. Those boulders weren't rocks, they were blast shields. Behind them, dug deep into the mountain, would be reinforced firing ports, murder holes that covered the entire valley floor with interlocking fields of fire. "They built it again," she murmured, the realization landing with the weight of a stone. The enemy hadn't just found a good spot to hide. They had constructed a kill box designed specifically to trap a helicopter insertion force. She adjusted the contrast on the thermal layer. There, faintly, deep within the shadow of the center rock, was a heat bloom. It was minuscule, easily dismissed as solar retention, but it pulsed. A rhythmic venting of warm air. Someone was breathing down there, or a generator was running. The clock on her screen ticked relentlessly. The briefing in the JOC would be starting in less than 20 minutes. Admiral Sterling would be finalizing the insertion points, drawing lines on a map that led directly into the throat of the beast. Elena knew she couldn't just walk in there with words. Mercer had proven that. She needed hard copy. She needed something they could hold in their hands, something that couldn't be dismissed as a hunch. She hit the print command. The laser printer in the corner whirred to life, the sound shockingly loud in the quiet room. Chug, chug, chug. It spat out the high-resolution comparison photos, one by one. Each page was an indictment of the current plan. Each page was a potential life saved. As she reached for the papers, her hand trembled slightly. Not from fear of the enemy, but from the weight of what she was about to do. She was about to walk into a room full of the most powerful men in the military and tell them they were wrong. She was about to expose herself, to step out of the shadows she had carefully cultivated for years. She gathered the warm sheets of paper and squared them against the desk. The ink smelled sharp and fresh. Time to go to war, she said to the empty room. She stood up, straightened her blouse, and walked toward the door. This time, she wouldn't stop at the secretary's desk. The Joint Operations Center was a theater of war, windowless and pressurized. The air inside was recycled and stale, carrying the distinct metallic scent of overheated electronics and the underlying musk of nervous sweat. In the center of the room, a massive digital table glowed, casting an eerie, upward illumination on the faces of the assembled officers. Elena slipped through the rear door just as the heavy lock clicked shut behind a tray of sandwiches being brought in for the brass. She pressed herself against the back wall, deep in the shadows, clutching the warm stack of printer paper to her chest. She was an intruder here, a non-entity in a room full of eagles and stars. Admiral Sterling stood at the head of the Saint table, a laser pointer in his hand. He dominated the space. Even the low hum of the projector seemed to quiet down when he spoke. "Gentlemen, the timeline has shifted," Sterling announced, his voice carrying to the corners of the room without effort. "Intelligence suggests the hostages are being moved at dawn. We do not have the luxury of a slow approach. We are going in hard and fast." The laser dot danced across the topographical map on the wall, tracing a red line that cut through the jagged terrain like a fresh wound. "Team 1 and Team 2 will insert via MH-60s at LZ Alpha," Sterling continued. "From there, it is a 3-kilometer movement to contact through the northern defile. We use the canyon walls for cover, masking our acoustic signature. We hit the compound before they finish their morning prayers. Speed is our security." Elena watched the red dot move. It traced the path of the dried riverbed, winding directly between the two imposing ridges she had just analyzed. The northern defile he mentioned wasn't cover. It was a coffin. The canyon walls wouldn't mask their sound. They would amplify it, turning the valley into an echo chamber where gunfire would be deafening and directional awareness impossible. "Sir," a commander from the aviation wing spoke up hesitantly, "the wind shear in that pass is unpredictable at night. If we have to abort the landing—" "We do not abort," Sterling cut him off, his tone final. "My pilots can fly a needle through a hurricane. The risk is acceptable. The alternative is letting those hostages disappear into the tribal belt. I am not letting that happen on my watch." The aviation commander nodded and stepped back, chastened. The message was clear. Dissent was synonymous with cowardice. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt loud enough to give away her position. She knew the protocol. An E5 sergeant does not interrupt a flag officer during a mission brief. It was suicide. But she looked at the map again, imagining the 12 men walking into the crossfire of those concealed murder holes. She saw the flashes of muzzle fire in her mind, saw the bodies falling in the dust, just like her team. "We have the element of surprise," Sterling concluded, looking around the room. "The enemy expects us to come from the south, from the open desert. They will never anticipate a direct insertion through the rocks." He paused, resting his hand on the digital table, leaning forward with the weight of command. "Are there any further objections to the insertion plan before we initiate the go code?" The room went silent. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. Officers looked at their boots or studied their tablets, avoiding the Admiral's gaze. No one wanted to be the one to say, "But." Elena took a breath. It was a sniper's breath. In through the nose, deep into the diaphragm, held for a heartbeat to steady the hands. "Yes, Admiral," a voice said from the back of the room. It took a moment for everyone to realize the voice didn't belong to any of the officers at the table. Heads turned, craning to look into the shadows. Sterling straightened up, squinting against the glare of the projector. Elena stepped forward into the pool of light. She didn't look like a hero. She looked like a tired, pale woman in an ill-fitting uniform, holding a stack of papers like a shield. But her eyes were dry and steady. "I object," she said, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength. "That route is not a surprise, sir. It is a trap." The silence that followed her statement was absolute, heavy enough to crush the air out of the room. It was the kind of silence usually reserved for a misfire on a gunnery range, a mix of shock and immediate visceral danger. Admiral Sterling did not shout. He did not explode. Instead, he lowered his laser pointer slowly, clicking it off. The red dot vanished from the map, leaving the jagged contours of the canyon in stark, digital relief. He turned his head, pivoting his entire body to face the interruption. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone carved by decades of command. "Excuse me?" Sterling asked. His voice was dangerously soft, carrying the quiet menace of a predator that knows it has no natural enemies in the room. "The Northern Defile," Elena repeated, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the sudden dryness in her throat. She stepped closer to the table, entering the halo of light cast by the projector. "It is a trap, Admiral. The terrain analysis suggests—" "Stop!" Sterling held up a hand. It was a casual gesture, but it halted her mid-sentence as effectively as a physical barrier. He looked her up and down, taking in the standard-issue fatigues, the lack of combat patches, the scuffed boots of someone who walked on gravel, not mountains. "Who are you?" "Sergeant Elena Vance, J2 Intelligence Analyst, attached to FOB Dust Bowl Support Element." Sterling let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh if it held any humor. He turned back to the room, scanning the faces of his senior officers. "Does anyone know why a support analyst is interrupting a top-secret strategic planning session?" "She must have slipped in the back, sir." Captain Mercer stood up quickly, his face pale. "Sergeant, remove yourself immediately. You are out of line." "I have data that contradicts the insertion plan," Elena persisted, ignoring Mercer and locking eyes with the Admiral. She held out the sheaf of papers. "The rocks on the northern ridge. They are not natural formations. They are engineered firing positions. I have seen this pattern before." Sterling did not take the papers. He didn't even look at them. He looked at her eyes, searching for fear, and finding only a stubborn, cold resolve that seemed to irritate him more than incompetence would have. "You have seen it before?" Sterling stepped away from the table, closing the distance between them. He invaded her personal space, using his height and bulk to intimidate. "On a screen? In a simulation?" "Tell me, Sergeant Vance, in your vast experience analyzing supply routes and weather reports, have you ever actually been downrange?" The room seemed to shrink. Officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The air conditioner hummed, oblivious to the tension. "The data is accurate, sir," Elena said, evading the trap. "Answer the question," Sterling snapped. The veneer of politeness vanished. "Have you ever held a weapon in a firefight? Have you ever stepped 1 foot outside the wire when bullets were flying? Or is your expertise limited to air-conditioned containers and PowerPoint slides?" A ripple of low chuckles moved through the back of the room, the nervous, sycophantic laughter of men glad they weren't the target. Elena felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of anger that she brutally suppressed. She could tell him. She could tell him about the weight of a customized long-range rifle, about the smell of blood mixed with dust, about the 3 days she spent lying in her own waste waiting for a target to show his face. She could tell him that she had saved more seals from a distance than he had ever met. But that life was gone. That person was redacted. If she spoke of it, she broke the non-disclosure agreements that kept her out of a military prison. "My combat experience is not the issue," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming steel. "The issue is that if you send 12 men into that canyon, they will be engaging targets they cannot see from positions they cannot defend." "You are a tourist here, Sergeant," Sterling sneered, turning his back on her as if she were dismissed. "You look at pixels. We deal in realities. I have operators with 20 years of experience who have vetted this route. I trust their eyes more than your patterns." He walked back to the head of the table. "Security, escort the sergeant out, and have her commander write her up for insubordination." 2 MPs at the door stepped forward, their hands resting on their belts. Elena didn't move. She didn't retreat. She tightened her grip on the papers until the edges crinkled. "If you ignore this," she said to his back, her voice ringing clear over the sound of the approaching MPs, "you are not just risking the mission. You are burying those men." Sterling froze. Sterling turned around slowly. The movement was deliberate, stripping the room of whatever oxygen remained. He walked back toward her, stopping just outside of arm's reach. The MPs hesitated, sensing a shift in the dynamic that superseded their orders to remove her. "Burying them," Sterling repeated, tasting the words. "You have 5 seconds to explain that statement before I have you thrown in the brig for conduct unbecoming." Elena did not flinch. She stepped past the Admiral, ignoring the collective gasp of the staff officers, and slapped her printed photos onto the glass surface of the digital map. "Your wind calculations are wrong," she stated flatly. Her voice had changed. The hesitation of the subordinate was gone, replaced by the clinical, detached tone of a technician discussing a faulty circuit. "My meteorologist is a lieutenant commander with a PhD," Sterling said, his eyes narrowing. "He modeled the wind shear based on the current pressure front." "He modeled it for aviation," Elena countered, pointing a finger at the contour lines of the northern ridge. "He calculated laminar flow over the peaks to ensure the helos don't crash. He didn't calculate the ballistic wind inside the canyon floor." She looked up at the map, tracing the invisible currents with her hand. "At 0200 hours, the thermal inversion in this valley breaks. The heat radiating from the shale creates a vertical updraft that collides with the prevailing wind. It creates a vortex, a cyclone effect." Sterling looked at the map, then back at her. "So?" "So," Elena continued, the adrenaline sharpening her focus to a razor's edge. "Your Overwatch snipers will dial their scopes for a standard crosswind. 3 mils left, maybe 4. But the bullet won't go left. The vortex will lift it and spin it high right. They will miss every initial shot. And while they are adjusting, the enemy, who has pre-ranged every inch of that kill zone, will be firing plunging fire from these rocks, which are actually fortified dead space." The room was silent. A few of the SEAL team leaders exchanged glances. It was dense, technical jargon, but it was delivered with the terrifying fluency of someone who had lived it. "You are quoting manuals at me," Sterling scoffed, though his voice lacked the absolute dismissal it held a moment ago. "Textbook theory. Real-world ballistics are messy. My operators know how to read trace." "Reading trace takes time," Elena snapped back. "And in that funnel, trace is invisible because of the dust swirl. I know this because the wind call in the Korangal is exactly the same." She pulled the second photo from her stack. It was the zoomed-in image of the rocks. Look at the angle of the loopholes. They are cut at a 30-degree depression. That is not for observation. That is for grazing fire. If your team moves in a file, the first machine gun opens up and hits the last man. The second gun hits the first man. You are trapped in the middle with no cover and no air support because the canyon walls are too steep for a strafing run. Sterling stared at the photo. He was looking at the grain of the image, the shadows that Elena claimed were murder holes. For a second, doubt flickered in his eyes. But then the pride of rank, the inertia of command, slammed the door shut. He couldn't let an analyst rewrite a mission based on shadows and wind theory. It would undermine the entire chain of command. "You have a vivid imagination, Sergeant," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a growl. "But I do not cancel operations based on the hallucinations of a desk clerk who thinks she understands snipercraft because she read a field manual." "It is not a manual," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper, but vibrating with intensity. "It is physics, and it is blood." "Enough!" Sterling stepped closer, his chest almost touching her shoulder. He loomed over her, radiating heat and anger. "You are done. You have wasted my time. You have insulted my staff, and you have questioned the competence of the finest warriors in the Navy." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "Get out of my war room. If I see your face again, I will strip those stripes off your sleeve myself." Elena stood her ground, her eyes locking with his. She saw the stubbornness in him. The same stubbornness that made him a great leader was now blinding him. She had fired her best shot, and it had bounced off his armor. "The wind is 12 miles per hour, full value from the 9 o'clock, she whispered, a final desperate plea in the language of the gun. "Please, sir, check the hold." "MPs!" Sterling roared. "Get her out!" The grip of the military police on Elena's arms was firm, bordering on painful. It was the physical manifestation of the chain of command crushing a loose link. One MP, a corporal who looked barely old enough to shave, muttered an apology under his breath as he twisted her arm behind her back, but he didn't loosen his hold. "You are making a mistake," Elena said, not struggling, but leaning back against the force dragging her toward the heavy steel doors. Her eyes never left Sterling. "Admiral, if you launch now without verifying the thermal pockets, you are flying blind." "Get her out of my sight!" Sterling barked, turning his back on her to face the main console. "And Captain Mercer, draft the charges. Insubordination. Conduct prejudicial to good order. I want her stripped of rank and on the first transport back to the States." "Yes, Admiral," Mercer replied, looking vindicated. The air in the room felt thick, charged with the static of unspoken tension. The staff officers kept their heads down, typing furiously on their terminals, desperately trying to look busy to avoid drawing the Admiral's ire. Elena was 3 steps from the door, 3 steps from being exiled into the dusty oblivion of the logistics yard, when the comms station in the corner erupted. "Priority traffic!" The communications officer, a young lieutenant with a headset pressed tight against his ear, stood up so fast his chair toppled over. His face was drained of blood. "Admiral, we have a timeline deviation. Team 1 reports wheels down. I repeat, Team 1 is on the deck." Sterling spun around. "What?" "The go code was set for 2100. It is 2045. "Pilot discretion, sir," the lieutenant stammered, his hand trembling as he adjusted the frequency. Wind speeds at the primary LZ were increasing. They made the call to insert early to avoid scrubbing the mission. They are already moving to the rally point. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness. It was the silence of a vacuum before an explosion. Elena stopped moving. The MPs, sensing the shift in the room's gravity, instinctively loosened their grip. "They are early," Elena whispered. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. "That means the thermal inversion hasn't broken yet. The updraft is at its peak." Sterling ignored her, striding toward the main screen. "Pull up the ISR feed, now! I want eyes on my men." The massive digital wall at the front of the room flickered. The topographical map vanished, replaced by the grainy, high-contrast monochrome of a Predator drone's infrared camera circling 20,000 feet above the target. The image stabilized. 12 heat signatures, glowing white-hot against the cool gray of the desert floor, were moving in a tactical column. They looked small, fragile. They were entering the mouth of the canyon, moving with the deceptive slowness of professionals. "Team leader reports green across the board," the comms officer relayed. "Moving to phase line Alpha. No contact." "Good," Sterling exhaled, the tension in his shoulders dropping slightly. "They are professionals. They adapted. Keep the channel open." But Elena didn't see professionals adapting. She saw ghosts walking into a graveyard. From her position near the door, she could see the thermal bloom of the canyon walls on the big screen. The rocks she had pointed out, the ones Sterling had dismissed as imagination, were cooling slower than the surrounding shale. That meant they were dense, reinforced. She shook off the MP's hand. He didn't try to stop her this time. He was too busy staring at the screen. "Look at the edges," she said, her voice cutting through the room, no longer asking for permission. "Look at the heat bleed around the boulders. That is not natural retention. That is body heat venting from a tunnel system." "Sergeant, you are still here?" Mercer hissed, though his eyes darted nervously to the screen. "Sir," the comms officer interrupted, his voice pitching up. "Team leader reports strange acoustics. They are hearing movement. Echoes." Sterling leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the table. "Clarify. What kind of movement?" "They can't localize it, sir. The sound is bouncing off the canyon walls. They think they are being tracked." Suddenly, the overhead lights in the JOC cut out, replaced instantly by the low crimson glow of the battle station's mode. The action-imminent alarm had been triggered. The room was bathed in the color of blood. Elena took a step back into the room. The cold open was approaching. The nightmare she had predicted was no longer a probability on a spreadsheet. It was unfolding in real time, in high definition, and there was absolutely nothing anyone in this room could do to stop it. "They are not being tracked," Elena said into the red darkness. "They are being herded." Sterling didn't kick her out. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the screen, where the 12 white dots were, moving deeper into the throat of the northern defile, straight toward the waiting darkness. The Joint Operations Center had transformed into a tomb, illuminated by crimson light. The only sound was the hum of the cooling fans and the crackle of the encrypted radio channel. On the main wall, the high-definition feed from the Predator drone played out like a silent film of impending doom. 12 white distinct shapes moved in a staggered column formation along the canyon floor. They were ghostly figures in the monochrome world of thermal imaging, their body heat radiating brightly against the cooling desert sand. To the uninitiated, they looked like predators on the prowl. To Elena, they looked like targets moving across a shooting range. "Team leader to base," the radio crackled. the voice whispering but crystal clear. Passing phase line Bravo. Canyon walls are narrowing. Still hearing that echo. No visuals on hostiles. Copy, team leader, the comms officer replied, his voice tight. Eye in the sky shows clear path ahead. You are green. Elena stood near the door, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her eyes were not on the seals. She was scanning the periphery, the jagged black shapes of the ridges that loomed over the valley floor like the teeth of a trap. She forced her breathing to slow down, fighting the physiological response of her own body. The red light of the room triggered memories of the medevac chopper, the sticky feeling of blood on her hands, the smell of burnt flesh. She pushed it all aside, channeling the panic into focus. She divided the screen into grids in her mind, searching for anomalies. The drone operator was panning the camera smoothly, following the team. Stop panning, she whispered, too low for anyone to hear. Check your 6. As if mocking her, the camera continued its forward sweep. Then she saw it. It was minuscule, a flicker of gray that turned slightly whiter for a fraction of a second. It was located on the northern ridge, exactly where she had identified the artificial rock formation. It wasn't a large heat signature, like a vehicle or a campfire. It was small, rhythmic, and fading fast. There, Elena said, her voice cutting through the silence. She pointed a trembling finger at the top right quadrant of the screen. Rewind that feed. 2 seconds. Sterling turned to look at her, his face a mask of annoyance. Sergeant, you are testing my patience. Rewind it, she insisted, stepping forward until she was beside the comms console. Sector 4, elevation 200 meters. Look at the heat bleed. The drone operator, a young Air Force tech sergeant, looked at the Admiral for permission. Sterling hesitated, then gave a curt nod. The operator tapped a key, and the video looped back. Freeze it, Elena commanded. The image stopped. There, pixelated and grainy, was the anomaly. That is a rock retaining solar heat, Mercer dismissed immediately. The sun set 2 hours ago. The shale retains energy. Rocks do not breathe, Elena said, her voice dropping to a chill whisper. That is a spotter. He vented his ghillie suit. Look at the rhythm. It is a pulse. Heat out, cool air in. Heat out. She turned to Sterling, her eyes wide with urgency. He is signaling. The rhythm matches the team's movement. Every time they take 10 steps, he pulses. He is counting them into the kill box. Sterling stared at the screen. He squinted at the gray blob. It was ambiguous at best. To accept her interpretation meant aborting a mission that was already underway, recalling elite troops based on a pixel that might just be a warm stone. Comms, ask the team if they have thermal contact on the ridges, Sterling ordered. Negative, sir. The reply came instantly. Team snipers are scanning. They report cold rocks. No signatures. They can't see him because he is behind the thermal blanket I told you about. Elena slammed her hand on the console, the sound startling everyone. He is recessed in the cave mouth. The drone is looking down at an angle. The team is looking up from the floor. He is in the dead space. The only reason we saw that flash is because he moved to check his wire. Wire? Sterling asked, his brow furrowing. The pressure plates, Elena said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. He isn't just counting them. He is waiting for them to breach the door at the end of the valley. The door is the trigger. On the screen, the lead SEAL raised a fist. The column stopped. They were stacking up outside a heavy wooden gate set into the cliff face, the entrance to the target compound. Breaching charge up, the radio crackled, ready to make entry. No, Elena breathed. Do not breach that door. Master Chief, Sterling keyed his mic, ignoring her. Proceed with breach. You are clear. Elena looked at the Admiral, then at the screen. The soldier on the screen was attaching a strip of explosives to the wood. In 10 seconds, he would detonate it. In 11 seconds, the vibration would travel up the wire to the spotter on the ridge. In 12 seconds, the mountain would explode. She had run out of time. Words were useless. Protocol was a death sentence. Elena lunged for the console. The distance between Elena and the main communications console was less than 10 feet, but crossing it felt like running through water. The moment she lunged, the room erupted into chaos. The red emergency lights painted the scene in violently shifting shadows, turning the orderly command center into a surreal nightmare. "Security! Restrain her!" Mercer screamed, his voice cracking with panic. The MP corporal, who had been hesitant moments before, reacted on instinct. He grabbed for Elena's shoulder, his fingers digging into the fabric of her uniform. But Elena was no longer the passive analyst filing reports. She dropped her center of gravity, twisting her body with a fluidity born of combat survival training, breaking his grip. She didn't strike him. She simply used his momentum to propel herself forward, crashing into the edge of the digital table. "Do not breach that door, Admiral," she shouted, her voice raw, tearing through the confused shouting of the staff officers. "The thermal decay on the ridge is too consistent." Sterling spun around, his face a mask of fury. To him, this wasn't a warning. It was a mutiny in the middle of a delicate operation. "Get this analyst off the comms," Sterling roared at the security team swarming toward her. "Master Chief, proceed with the breach. We are on the clock." Elena slammed her hands onto the console, her fingers flying across the tactile interface. She wasn't trying to hack the system. She was physically overriding the transmission lock. She keyed the all-call override, a channel reserved for extreme distress signals. "Sir, please listen," she pleaded, ignoring the hands grabbing at her waist and arms. "That is not background radiation from the rocks. It is a rhythmic heat signature. A spotter. If your team kicks that door, they trigger the pressure plates wired to the spotter's line of sight. It is a kill box." "You are a Sergeant E5. Sterling stepped forward, his presence looming over her like a thunderhead. "I am an Admiral commanding SEAL Team 6 elements. Do not presume to lecture me on tactical entry based on a satellite feed and a hunch." "It is not a hunch!" Elena yelled back, her eyes wild, staring directly into his. "It is the exact same grid setup used in the Kandahar Valley ambush 7 years ago. I know because I was the one who had to neutralize the spotter." "Enough," Sterling signaled to the MPs who had finally pinned her arms. "Security, remove her from the Joint Operations Center. Drag her out if you have to." 2 heavy sets of hands clamped onto her biceps, wrenching her back. The pain was sharp, radiating up her shoulders, but the image of the 12 men on the screen filled her mind. They were seconds away from vaporization. The logic of the chain of command meant nothing against the physics of high explosives. "Look at the map, sir. Just look at the elevation." Elena lunged forward one last time, fighting against the restraint with a ferocity that shocked the MPs. She wasn't attacking them. She was clawing her way back to the data. She threw her left arm out, slamming her hand down onto the touch surface to bring up the magnified topography of the northern ridge. In the violence of the struggle, the cuff of her uniform blouse snagged on the sharp metal corner of the console frame. As the MPs yanked her backward and she pulled forward, the fabric tore. The sleeve rode up her forearm, bunching at the elbow, exposing the pale skin of her inner wrist to the harsh, unforgiving light of the command center. The fluorescent lights, now mixing with the red combat strobes, caught the ink. It was dark, precise, and impossible to miss. A stylized eye trapped inside a chaotic, geometric spiral, the eye of the storm. Below it, a faded, jagged string of latitude and longitude coordinates was tattooed in a script that looked like it had been carved with a knife. Sterling's hand, raised to signal the final removal order, stopped in midair. The room went silent. The shouting died in throats. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the struggle and the static hiss from the speakers. Sterling stared at the wrist of the woman he had just dismissed as a clerk. He knew that symbol. Every special operator in the Navy knew that symbol. It wasn't something you got in a parlor on shore leave. It was a unit insignia for a ghost detachment that didn't officially exist. A unit that had been wiped out to a man, save for one survivor who had held a ridge alone for 3 days. The coordinates were for the Korengal Valley. The silence stretched, heavier than the static on the radio. The MPs, sensing the Admiral's paralysis, loosened their grip, confused by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "Wait," the Admiral whispered, his voice cracking, the authority draining out of it to be replaced by a dawn of horror and recognition. He looked from the tattoo to Elena's face. He really looked at her for the first time. He saw past the messy hair and the analyst's uniform. He saw the 1,000-yard stare. He saw the sniper. "Belay that breach order," Sterling said, his voice trembling slightly. Then he grabbed the microphone himself, shouting into it. "All teams, hold position. Abort breach. I repeat, abort breach. Hold position. Acknowledge." The voice of the Master Chief on the ground crackled through the speakers, breathless and confused. "Copy, actual. Holding position. We are 5 meters from the breach point. Charges are set. Requesting clarification on the abort order." "Stand by," Sterling said into the microphone. He lowered the handset slowly, the plastic clicking against the console, a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden quiet of the room. He did not look at the screen. He did not look at his staff officers, who were frozen in various states of shock. His eyes were locked on Elena's wrist, where the torn sleeve revealed the faded black ink. The eye of the storm. It was a crude, geometric design, likely done in the field with a sterilized needle and Indian ink. It wasn't decorative. It was a totem. Sterling knew the history of that symbol. It belonged to a task force that had been officially disbanded and scrubbed from the public record 7 years ago. Task Force Wraith. They were the ghosts of the border wars, a unit of deep reconnaissance snipers who operated without support, miles beyond the wire. Legend had it they were wiped out in an ambush in the Korengal Valley, sacrificed to save a conventional unit that had wandered into a trap. Only one operator had walked out of that valley alive, carrying the dog tags of the entire team. That operator was rumored to have held off a company-sized element of insurgents for 3 days with a single bolt-action rifle, creating a perimeter of death so precise that the enemy stopped advancing. Sterling had told that story to his junior officers for years. He used it as a parable of discipline and marksmanship. He had built a myth around the ghost of Korengal. He had never imagined the ghost was a woman standing in front of him, currently being restrained by a 20-year-old military police corporal. "Release her," Sterling ordered. His voice was low, barely a whisper, but it carried a strange new weight. The MPs hesitated, looking between the Admiral and the prisoner. "I said, step away from her," Sterling barked, the sudden volume making everyone jump. The corporal released Elena's arm as if it were red-hot iron. Elena didn't move. She didn't rub her bruised arm or fix her torn sleeve. She stood perfectly still, her chest heaving slightly from the exertion, her eyes still fixed on the thermal feed on the big screen. "The coordinates," Sterling said, stepping closer to her. He pointed a trembling finger at the numbers tattooed beneath the spiral. 35 degrees north, 70 degrees east. That is the extraction point for Operation Mountain Viper. Elena looked at him then. The anger was gone from her eyes, replaced by a weary, ancient sadness. "It is where my team died, Admiral. And it is where I learned that rocks in this region don't retain heat like that unless someone is living inside them." The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a gale. The staff officers stared at the lowly analyst with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. They were witnessing the collapse of the hierarchy they lived by. Sterling felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He thought about the insults he had thrown at her. Tourist, desk clerk, textbook theory. He had questioned the courage of someone who had likely forgotten more about survival than he would ever know. The shame was a physical taste, bitter and metallic. He looked back at the screen, at the 12 men waiting in the dark. If he had let them breach that door, they would be dead. And the person who had stopped him was the one person he had tried to throw out of the room. "You are the survivor," Sterling said, the realization settling over him. It wasn't a question anymore. "You are Ghost One." Elena pulled her sleeve down, hiding the ink, hiding the history. She didn't want the glory. She didn't want the recognition. She just wanted the mission to succeed. "My call sign is irrelevant, sir," she said softly. "But the spotter on that ridge is real. And if your men stay there for another minute, he will realize the breach isn't coming, and he will detonate the secondary charges manually." Sterling stared at her. The arrogance that usually armored him was gone, stripped away by the revelation. He was no longer the smartest man in the room, and for the first time in his career, he was grateful for it. "What do we do?" Sterling asked. He wasn't asking a subordinate for a suggestion. He was asking a peer for orders. "What do we do?" The question hung in the air, stripping away the layers of rank that separated the admiral from the sergeant. It was an admission of helplessness that echoed off the steel walls of the Joint Operations Center. Elena did not hesitate. The transition was instantaneous. The analyst who filed supply reports vanished, replaced by the operator who had survived the impossible. She stepped up to the digital table, her finger stabbing at a depression in the topography map, 50 meters east of the team's current position. "The spotter is waiting for the door breach," Elena said, her voice rapid and precise. "When it does not happen, he will panic. He will assume they have been compromised, and he will blow the primary charges to collapse the canyon entrance. We have maybe 60 seconds before he realizes the silence is a threat." She looked up at Sterling. "You need to move them to the defilade behind that limestone shelf. It is a natural blind spot. The blast wave from the entrance will go over their heads, not through them." Sterling looked at the map, then at the live feed where his men were crouching in the kill zone, waiting for orders that were not coming. He looked at the communications officer, who was holding the handset with a trembling hand, waiting for the admiral to speak. But Sterling knew he did not have the language for this. He did not know the terrain like she did. He did not know the rhythm of this specific enemy. He made a decision that would haunt his career but save his conscience. He reached out and took the heavy tactical headset from the communications officer. He did not put it on. Instead, he extended it toward Elena. "They are yours, Sergeant," Sterling said. His voice was grim, devoid of the arrogance that had filled the room 10 minutes ago. "Get them out." Elena stared at the headset. It was a black piece of plastic and foam, scuffed from use. Taking it meant crossing a line from which there was no return. It meant accepting responsibility for 12 lives. If she was wrong, if her memory of the wind and the rocks was flawed, she would be the voice they heard before they died. She took it. The foam ear cups felt cold against her ears, a familiar, suffocating sensation that instantly transported her back to the dirt of the Korengal. She adjusted the boom microphone, her hands steady, her eyes narrowing as she focused solely on the monochrome image of the team on the screen. She pressed the transmit button. "Break, break," she said. Her voice on the channel was different, lower, flatter, stripped of all emotion. It was the voice of a controller. "All call signs. This is Ghost Actual. Interrogative, do you copy?" There was a pause on the line. The confusion on the ground must have been palpable. A female voice, unknown, unauthorized, claiming a call sign that had not been heard on a secure net in 7 years. "Station calling. Identify." The Master Chief's voice came back, tense and suspicious. "This is a closed net. Who is this?" "This is the person looking at the thermal bloom you are missing at your 2 o'clock high," Elena snapped, cutting through the protocol. "Master Chief, listen to me. The door is a pressure trigger. The ridge is wired. You are standing in a pressure cooker and the lid is about to blow. Do not argue. Do not look up." She watched the screen. The lead figure, the Master Chief, froze. "If you want to live," Elena continued, her eyes tracking the pulsing heat signature of the enemy spotter on the ridge, "you need to move your element 50 meters east. There is a limestone shelf. Get behind it. Now. Move." "Who is this?" the Master Chief demanded again, though he was already signaling his men to stand up. "Just move," Sterling shouted from behind her, leaning over the console, his voice booming into the open microphone. "That is a direct order, Chief. Follow her lead." The authority of the Admiral broke the deadlock. On the screen, the 12 white dots began to scramble, breaking formation and sprinting toward the eastern wall of the canyon. "Movement!" the drone operator shouted. "The heat signature on the ridge is spiking. He is reaching for something." "He is detonating," Elena said, her voice calm amidst the rising panic in the room. She watched the team running. They were heavy, laden with gear, moving through loose shale. They were too slow. "Run," she whispered to the screen. "Run!" The spotter on the ridge flared bright white on the thermal feed. A second later, the entrance to the cave, where the team had been standing 30 seconds ago, erupted. Even in the silent black and white of the drone feed, the violence was terrifying. A massive plume of white-hot debris exploded outward, filling the narrow canyon with a cloud of superheated dust and rock. The camera shook as the shockwave hit the drone's stabilization gyros. The screen dissolved into static for a heart-stopping second before stabilizing. "Status!" Sterling yelled. "Report status!" Elena pressed the headset tighter to her ear, listening to the static, waiting for a voice, waiting for a heartbeat, waiting for the ghosts to speak. The static on the radio was a living thing, a harsh, abrasive hiss that filled the Joint Operations Center with the sound of uncertainty. 5 seconds passed, then 10. On the main screen, The cloud of superheated dust from the explosion bloomed like a white flower, obscuring the thermal signatures of the 12 men on the canyon floor. Sterling gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. The silence was an accusation. "Base, this is Badger 1, a voice coughed through the speakers, choked with dust but undeniably alive. We are clear. Effective cover. No casualties. Repeat, no casualties." A collective exhale swept through the room, a release of tension so palpable it felt like a change in atmospheric pressure. But Elena did not exhale. She did not smile. Her eyes were darting between the drone feed and the topographical map. "Do not celebrate," she said into the headset, her voice cutting through the momentary relief. "Badger 1, keep your heads down. He missed the primary trigger, which means he is running for the secondary firing port. He will have a heavy machine gun set up to sweep your cover in 30 seconds. "Copy that, Ghost Actual," the Master Chief replied, the skepticism gone from his voice. "We are pinned. We can't see through the dust. What is your call?" Elena closed her eyes for a brief second, visualizing the tunnel network she had walked through 7 years ago. She knew how they dug them. She knew the escape angles. The spotter wouldn't stay on the ridge. He would move deeper into the mountain to a reinforced aperture that looked down on the limestone shelf. She opened her eyes and looked at the drone operator. "Do we have air on station?" "F-18s are holding at Angels 20, the operator responded instantly, "loaded with GBU-38s. "I need a solution on grid Bravo 6 Kilo, Elena commanded. She didn't look at Sterling for permission. She didn't need to. The headset was hers, and for this moment, the war was hers. "The target is deep buried. Delay fuse. We need to crack the rock shelf to collapse the tunnel." "That is danger close, Sergeant," the drone operator warned, looking at the proximity of the SEAL team to the target coordinates. "The fragmentation radius overlaps their position." "Badger 1, this is Ghost Actual," Elena said calmly. "I am bringing rain to your north. You are inside the frag radius. Hug the wall. Do not move a muscle." "Roger that," came the reply. "Bring it." Elena turned to the comms officer. "Clear the pilot hot." The room watched in silence as the invisible ballet of modern warfare played out on the screen. The drone laser painted the side of the mountain, a tiny, pulsing crosshair on a pile of nondescript rocks. "Rifle!" The pilot's voice came over the net, cool and detached. Seconds ticked by. The anticipation in the room was different now. It wasn't fear. It was the grim expectation of judgment. On the thermal feed, a streak of white light tore through the sky, impacting the ridge with kinetic violence that shook the camera frame. The screen flashed white, washing out all detail. When the sensors adjusted, the side of the mountain was gone. The heat signature of the spotter, the tunnel, and the machine gun nest had been erased, replaced by a crater of glowing rubble. "Good effect on target," the pilot confirmed. "Badger 1, report," Elena said. "Dusty, but safe," the Master Chief replied, his voice sounding weary but respectful. "Target neutralized. The shelf collapsed right where you said it would. We are moving to extract the VIP. Thanks for the save, Ghost." Elena slowly took the headset off. The foam was damp with sweat. Her hands, which had been steady as stone while she called in the airstrike, began to tremble slightly as the adrenaline receded. She placed the headset gently on the console. She didn't look at the cheering staff officers. She didn't look at Mercer, who was staring at her with his mouth slightly open. She looked at Sterling. The Admiral was standing motionless, his gaze fixed on the screen where the dust was settling over the saved lives of his men. He turned his head slowly to look at her. There was no anger left in his face, no arrogance, just a profound, quiet reckoning. He looked at the torn sleeve of her uniform, then up to her eyes. "You saved them," Sterling said softly, the words heavy in the quiet room. "They saved themselves, sir," Elena replied, her voice returning to the low, professional tone of a subordinate. "I just told them where to stand." She stepped back from the console, retreating into the shadows where she felt she belonged. The red emergency lights deactivated, and the room returned to the harsh, bright, fluorescent glare of standard operations. But everything had changed. The hierarchy had been dismantled and rebuilt in the span of 10 minutes, cemented by the ink on her wrist and the rubble in the valley. The dawn broke over the monitors before it broke over the desert outside. The grainy thermal feed had been replaced by the crisp, full-color video from the extraction choppers. The SEAL team, tired and dust-covered, was loading the secured hostages onto the ramp of a Chinook. The rotors whipped the sand into a frenzy, a visual echo of the violence that had just passed. But this time, it was the sound of safety. "Bird is away," the pilot's voice confirmed. "All souls on board. Estimated time of arrival at base, 40 mics." The Joint Operations Center deflated. The adrenaline that had sustained the room for the last hour evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, exhausted silence. Shoulders slumped, headsets were pulled down around necks, and the mundane hum of reality crept back in. Elena stood by the wall, away from the congratulatory handshakes being exchanged near the coffee station. She had found a piece of black electrical tape and was quietly repairing the tear in her sleeve. It was a temporary fix, crude and ugly, but it served its purpose. The eye and the coordinates were hidden again. The ghost was back in the bottle. Admiral Sterling stood at the head of the table. He hadn't moved since the airstrike. He watched the helicopter fly away on the screen, then slowly turned to face the room. His eyes skipped over the captains and commanders, landing squarely on the sergeant in the corner. He walked toward her. The room went quiet again, but this time the silence was respectful, curious. They watched the man with the stars approach the woman with the tape on her sleeve. "Sergeant Vance," Sterling said. His voice was hoarse. He cleared his throat. "Walk with me." It wasn't an order given in anger. It was a request. Elena nodded once and followed him. They didn't go far, just to the quiet alcove near the secure, heavy-duty printers, away from the prying ears of the staff. Sterling leaned against a filing cabinet, crossing his arms. He looked older than he had 2 hours ago. The armor of his rank seemed thinner. "I will be filing a report on this," Sterling started, looking at the floor. "But not the one I threatened. There will be no court-martial." "Thank you, sir," Elena said, her gaze fixed on a point on the wall over his shoulder. "I want to put you in for a commendation medal," Sterling continued, looking up at her. "Maybe a Bronze Star. You overrode a direct order, you seized control of a tactical net, and you saved 12 operators from a catastrophic ambush. The Navy needs to know what you did today." "With all due respect, Admiral," Elena interrupted him, her voice soft but firm. "No." Sterling blinked. "No. If you write that citation, you have to explain how I knew about the tunnel. You have to reference Task Force Wraith. You have to open a file that was sealed by the Pentagon to protect the families of the men who didn't come back." She looked down at her taped sleeve. "I am not a hero, sir. I am a survivor. Survivors don't get medals. We just get to remember." Sterling stared at her. He realized then that her silence wasn't about fear. It was about burden. She carried the weight of that dead team every day. A medal would just be another piece of metal to polish, another reminder of the day everyone else died. They walked into a trap because of arrogance, Sterling said quietly, admitting the sin he had almost repeated. My arrogance. They walked into a trap because the enemy is smart, sir, Elena corrected him gently. We just have to be smarter. And today, we were. She adjusted the cuff of her blouse, ensuring the tape held. If you want to thank me, Admiral, bury the report. Let me go back to my desk. Let me track the fuel convoys and count the MREs. That is where I am useful right now. Sterling looked at her for a long time, measuring the woman against the legend. He saw the resolve in her posture. She didn't want the glory. The glory was loud, and she had seen enough loud things for one lifetime. The report will be buried, Sterling agreed. The official log will state that the drone operator identified the threat, and I ordered the strike. Your name won't appear. Thank you, sir. But I will know, Sterling said, and my men will know. That is enough, Elena said. May I be dismissed, Admiral? I have a shift to finish. The morning logistics briefing is in 20 minutes. It was an absurd request given the context, but it was perfectly in character. She was grounding herself, returning to the routine that kept the chaos at bay. Sterling straightened up and nodded. Dismissed, Sergeant. Elena turned on her heel and walked back into the main room. She moved through the crowd of officers who were now looking at her with open awe, but she ignored them all. She sat down at her workstation, woke up her computer, and opened the spreadsheet for the water delivery schedule. Behind her, the sound of a pen cap clicking shut echoed in the quiet alcove, a final punctuation mark on the battle that never happened. The forward operating base had fully awakened. The rhythmic thumping of helicopters, the grinding gears of supply trucks, and the shouted orders of NCOs created a familiar industrial symphony outside the thin walls of the intelligence container. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of floor cleaner and stale coffee. Elena sat alone in her corner. Miller had gone to the mess hall for breakfast, leaving the office in a rare state of peace. She was back in her element, her eyes scanning rows of logistical data. To anyone passing by, she was just another support soldier, a cog in the machine ensuring that beans and bullets arrived at the right grid coordinates. The events of the last hour, the red lights, the screaming jets, the shaking ground, felt like a fever dream that had vanished with the sunrise. A shadow fell across her desk. It wasn't the fleeting shadow of someone passing by. It was stationary, blocking out the overhead light. Elena stopped typing. She didn't look up immediately. She finished entering a fuel consumption code, hit save, and then slowly swiveled her chair. Admiral Sterling stood there. He had cleaned up. The dust was gone from his uniform, his hair was combed, and he had regained the composed, towering aura of a flag officer. But his eyes were different. The sharp, dismissive edge was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary clarity. At ease, Sergeant, he said softly before she could stand. Stay seated. He looked around the cramped, cluttered workspace. He saw the piles of paperwork, the cheap government-issue pens, the motivational posters peeling off the walls. It was a world away from the high-tech sanctity of the Joint Operations Center. Yet this was where the war had been won. The team is debriefing now, Sterling said, his voice low enough not to carry beyond her cubicle walls. They are asking who Ghost Actual was. They want to buy her a drink. Ghost Actual doesn't exist, sir, Elena replied, her voice steady. It was just a glitch in the comms channel. Sterling smiled. It was a small, genuine expression that cracked his stoic mask. A glitch. Is that what we are calling it? He reached into his pocket. His hand moved slowly, deliberately. He pulled out a heavy, round object and placed it on the desk, right next to her keyboard. It wasn't a standard unit coin. It was heavy, minted in antique bronze, bearing the trident of the seals on one side and the personalized command stars of the Admiral on the other. In my community, we measure respect in actions, not paperwork, Sterling said. You will never wear the trident. You will never get the silver star you earned today. But you should carry this. Elena looked at the coin. In the military, a challenge coin from a commander of his rank was a currency of honor more valuable than a promotion. It was a handshake that said, I see you. Thank you, Admiral, she whispered. Sterling straightened up, adjusting his tunic. He looked at the door to ensure no one was watching, then looked back at her. Slowly, deliberately, the Admiral brought his hand up to the brim of his cover. He held the salute for a long beat. A 3-star Admiral saluting an E5 sergeant. It was a breach of every protocol in the book, and it was the highest honor he could bestow. Watch the wind, Sergeant, he said. Clear skies, Admiral, she replied. He dropped the salute, turned, and walked out of the container. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing out the noise of the base. Elena sat in silence for a moment. She reached out and touched the cool metal of the coin. She ran her thumb over the raised relief of the trident. Then, she opened the top drawer of her desk. Inside, hidden beneath a box of staples and a stack of post-it notes, was an old, faded photo of a team of 12 men standing in a valley, smiling at the camera. She placed the heavy coin gently next to the photo. She closed the drawer. With a deep breath, she pulled her left sleeve down tight, ensuring the button was secure, hiding the eye and the coordinates from the world. She turned back to her screen, her fingers finding the home row keys. Fuel Convoy 7 Alpha, she murmured to herself, typing the entry. Route green, schedule on time. The hero went back to work, invisible once more.